There is an unfortunate tendency in discussing Marx's relevance to law to focus on Marx's 1840s writings, which in many respects differ very dramatically from his later writings in the 1860s and 1870s. This is because, in the 1840s, Marx's phraseology is something which legal analysis can cognize. Marx is, at this point, still speaking about the laws of the state, rather than, as he later would, the laws of historical development, of production and exchange, and the laws of their physical interaction with the genesis of social systems. But a focus on these 1840s writings at the expense of Marx's writings and investigations into political economy proper in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s is an escape hatch for legal analysis, by which it can avoid confronting Marx's most radical challenge to law, made in the analysis of his later work, and that law is not only not autonomous, but is not autonomous in very definite, specific, and easily identifiable and describable ways. In the Afterword to the second German edition of Capital Volume 1, written in 1873, Marx notes of his writings in the 1840s saying that he had criticized Hegel when it was, quote, still the fashion, end quote. But by the time Marx was working on the first volume of Capital, throughout the late 1850s and early 1860s, it was, quote, the good pleasure of the peevish, arrogant, mediocre Epigones who now talk large in cultured Germany to treat Hegel in the same way as the brave Moses Mendelssohn in Lessing's time treated Spinoza, i.e. as a dead dog, end quote. Marx, on the one hand, quote, openly avowed himself the pupil of that mighty thinker, meaning Hegel, and on the other hand, even, quote, coquetted with the modes of expression particular to him, end quote. In Hegel, Marx writes one can perceive in a manner which Marx himself extensively criticizes, the, quote, general form of the working out of the dialectic in a comprehensive and conscious manner. To adopt a Hegelian structure in drafting and writing of the volumes of Capital, specifically Hegel's Science of Logic, was itself a provocative speech act. Why is this? It is because by the time that Marx is writing the volumes of Capital, he has, in addition to materially analyzing the actual phenomenon of capitalist production and exchange, Marx has philosophically identified the confusion inherent to the German reception of Hegel in the 1840s, which was a consequence of that actual phenomenon not being present in Germany at the time. Marx writes that what he had been addressing in The German Ideology, 1846, is the abstract speculation by the ruling classes about the conditions of the development of the forces of production and exchange attendant to capitalist accumulation, production, and exchange, without those conditions actually having occurred in Germany. This, the idle speculation of the moribund German ruling classes as to what it might be like to live under conditions of the full development of the capitalist modes of production and exchange, is the German ideology. As Marx writes, quote, this science had to be imported from England and France as a ready-made article. Its German professors remained schoolboys, end quote. The German ideology is not capable of interpretation without an appreciation of what role it was meant to play and to whom it was addressed. This is what Marx writes of. The incomprehension of the German intellectual caste, who first philosophically witnessed and interpreted the political-economic tumult of England and France in their economic, political, and geopolitical development. Quote, the theoretical expression of a foreign reality was turned in their heads into a collection of dogmas interpreted by them in terms of the petty trading world around them, and therefore misinterpreted, end quote. In this sense, the faulty thought which Marx criticizes in the young Hegelians is that which, in the view of the emergence of the capitalist modes of production and exchange, and the development of the means of production and exchange from elsewhere, is functionally pre-capitalist society. Quote, at a time when they were able to deal with the political economy in a straightforward fashion, modern economic conditions did not actually exist in Germany, end quote. Importantly, as Marx writes, as soon as these conditions did come into existence, they did so under circumstances that no longer allowed of their being really and impartially investigated within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon, end quote. Marx writes that political economy cannot function as a science insofar as, and to the extent that, it treats the existence of economic classes only in an isolated and sporadic fashion. Marx argues that the greatest representative of English political economy had made his discoveries in a time when there was no such obligatory mishandling of economic class, in which no such obligatory mishandling of economic class was required of the chattering epiphanies of politics and economics. David Ricardo had independently discovered in the science of political economy the, quote, the antagonism of class interests, of wages and profits, of profits and rent, and the starting point of his investigations, naively taking this antagonism for a social law of nature, end quote. Marx writes that opposition to even this conception by Ricardo was emerging within Ricardo's lifetime. Marx here makes fun of the ensuing decades of English political economy as that of a contest between the original insights of Ricardo and then those for whom even the existence of a difference of class interests was a bridge too far. As Marx writes, quote, splendid tournaments were held, end quote. The, quote, unprejudiced character of, end quote, of Ricardo's work and insights, Marx writes, quote, is explained by the circumstances of his time, end quote. Marx argues that the insight into the processes and development of production and exchange, Ricardo was able to discover and diagnose primary motive elements of the class struggle before the conscious and explicit denial of the import of these elements became an ideologically necessary condition for admittance into the profession of bourgeois, quote, political science. For most Marxist analysis, the years of 1848 to 1849 of the emergence of world revolution is considered crucial. It is interesting to find in this afterword to the first volume of Capital that Marx writes, in fact, 1830 was, quote, the decisive crisis, end quote. The owning class had, quote, conquered political power, end quote, and thus, quote, the class struggle, practically as well as theoretically, took on a more outspoken and threatening character, end quote. This, Marx writes, quote, sounded the death knell of scientific bourgeois economy, end quote. Because of the development of the forces of production and the social relation of production in both England and France, political economy could no longer conduct itself in a scientifically rigorous way. They constitutively had to obscure the existence of class antagonism and its genesis. As G.V. Plekhanov writes in Art and Social Life, after 1848, quote, having discovered the secret of the struggle between the classes, between their class and the proletariat, the bourgeois ideologists gradually lost the faculty for calm scientific investigation of social phenomena, and this greatly lowered the inherent value of their more or less scientific works. Whereas formerly bourgeois political economy was able to produce scientific giants like David Ricardo, now the tone among its exponents was set by such garrulous dwarfs as Frederick Bastiat, end quote. The truth or falsity of the fact of the class antagonism became irrelevant to political economy. What became relevant was whether its acknowledgement was, quote, useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, politically dangerous or not, end quote. Quote, in place of disinterested inquirers, there were hired prize fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and the evil intent of the apologetic, end quote. The revolutions in Europe in the middle of the 19th century were recognized in political economy in England, however. As Marx writes, Quote, men who still claim some scientific standing and aspire to be something more than mere sophists and sycophants of the ruling classes tend to harmonize the political economy of capital with the claims, no longer to be ignored, of the proletariat, end quote. The best representative of this, quote, shallow syncretism, end quote, Marx writes, is John Stuart Mill. Of this intellectual giant, Mill, of whom our most esteemed professors speak so highly, Marx writes, his work represents, quote, a declaration of bankruptcy by bourgeois economy, event on which the Russian scholar and critic T. Chersnowski has thrown light of a mastermind in his Outlines of Political Economy according to Mill, end quote. Therefore, as Marx writes, the capitalist modes of production and exchange developed in Germany only after, quote, its antagonistic character has already in France and England shown itself in a fierce strife of classes, end quote. Once such conditions had developed, Marx writes, professors flooded into one of two camps. One, Bastiat, who was, as Marx writes, the most, quote, the most superficial and therefore the most adequate representative of the apologetic of vulgar economy, end quote, and two, the followers of John Stuart Mill, men of science in, quote, the attempt to reconcile irreconcilabilities, end quote. Of Bastiat, his view was that the inexorable grinding down of those for whom their only possession was in the power over their own labor by the landholding and capital holding classes was and is good. That this class was to be used up like coal, and that was the lot of the poor, for which they should be thankful. The state, said Bastiat, should never and under no circumstances ever intervene in the struggle between classes to alleviate the conditions of the poor, lest their reprieve from poverty and immiseration in the slightest way upset the owning class's opportunity to extract from them their excess labor under favorable terms. Disease, hunger, poverty, neglect, industrial poison, degradation and death of the working masses engendered by the dissolution of the primitive feudal and post-feudal modes of production and exchange, the establishment of reserve armies of disposable humans as so-called free labor, was and is, according to Bastiat, their lot in life. Any attempt to intervene or ameliorate this at all is an unacceptable expenditure by a public body whose only proper purpose is to ensure the rights of property are absolutely and unequivocally enforced. In this, Bastiat stands at the head of economic theories that would later be taken up by Friedman and Hayek, and indeed by Hans Kelsen in their anti-communist writings. Of John Stuart Mill, his view was that the development of the means of production and exchange along the lines of private property produced horrendous and unacceptable social degradation, but that this poverty, want, disease, and destruction of the bodies and lives of working people in the process of capitalist production and exchange could and should be ameliorated by means of state intervention. Thus, Mill is regarded as one of the great fathers of liberalism in Anglo-American and Commonwealth thought. But the German ideology is the abstract speculation to which the orientation towards the societal and social ills of mass alienation of living labor under conditions of capitalist production and exchange give rise to, with those conditions not actually, in fact, existing in any developed form in the circumstances of the German ideologists themselves, and in the situation they were writing from. Of these German professors in their respective camps of Bastiat and Mill, Marx writes that, quote, just as in the classical time of bourgeois economy, so also in the time of its decline, the Germans remained mere schoolboys, imitators and followers, petty retailers and hawkers, in the service of the great foreign wholesale concern, end quote. Marx writes that the mystified form and reception of Hegel in Germany in the 1840s, because it, quote, seemed to transfigure and to glorify the existing state of things, end quote. However, as Marx writes, the rational form of Hegel's dialectic, in its scientific implications, is, quote, a scandal and an abomination to bourgeoisdom, and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension the affirmative recognition of the state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historical developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature, not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary." End quote.